Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Baker. I'm your facilitator. I work with North Carolina Sea Grant and Fisheries. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Our presentation slots are 20 minutes, so we're going to really try to stay to that 20-minute slot. If speakers run over 15 minutes or so, I'll start flashing the cards so we have a little bit of time for questions. Once we get to that 20-minute spot, depending if we have a lot of questions, we're going to move on. And then at the end, we should have about 10 minutes. And if that's the case, then we can answer further questions. And if not, maybe we can reach the other speakers after the presentation or at lunch. So with that, our first speaker is Eric Herbst from North Carolina Sea Grant. And Eric's going to talk about the Shellfish Farming Academy.
Is it possible to dim the lights a little bit? Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is my first coastal conference. I started with Sea Grant 2 years ago, summer of 2020. And this was one of the first big projects I had the pleasure of being involved in. The credit really goes to these four gentlemen. They were the ones who came up with the idea and really put the proposal together and got the funding. And there's a lot of work going into this ahead of time. And it's really a story about partnerships and capacity building and capital or fundraising as well. So our North Carolina shellfish industry really centers around the eastern oyster, hard clams, and soft crabs. For the Farming Academy, we really wanted to focus on bivalves. So we really kept to just teaching about eastern oysters and hard clams. So North Carolina has provided for the private use of public trust waters for shellfish cultivation for over 150 years. Oysters in particularly have a deep-rooted history of cultural and economic importance for North Carolina coastal communities. And historically, that's been extensive bottom culture, growing oysters on the bottom. In terms of community building, I can't think of another species that helps build communities better than the eastern oyster. If you've ever been to an oyster roast, a North Carolina oyster roast, they're just absolutely wonderful events, and they really do center on building community. And this is the first oyster roast I had the pleasure of attending at Seamast in Carteret County last spring. Those are some local growers there growing oysters from the Newport River. And we had a local band, well, not a local band, but we had a band come in and provide music. It was just a wonderful opportunity. That's Carteret Community College students there shucking oysters grown on the lease at Carteret Community College, right in the back of the Seamast building. And we had a number of commercial partners and growers show up and shuck their oysters for this event. We had the VFW provide a pig roast and barbecue. Just a great time and wonderful sense of community. And there's some steamed oysters going on the table on the left there. And that's my wife on the right. She loves oysters. So she's very happy. But the growth of the industry has really taken off in the last 10 years or so. And that's really due to and driven by the half shell market. So huge demand for oysters on the half shell over the last 15 years or so. This is the number of lease applications that North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries receives every year. So in green, we have bottom leases. In blue, we have water column leases. That's mainly for the half shell industry. And then I'm kind of color challenged, but in kind of fuchsia there is the total number of applications. You can see in 2017, everybody and their brother decided they were going to get rich growing oysters for the half shell market in North Carolina. So just huge numbers of applications in 2017, and it's been relatively sustained. We've had a few dips due to some weather events, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Dorian, and then we had COVID, of course, in 2020. But now it's bouncing back, and every year DMF is getting, a substantial number of applications for shellfish leases here in the state. And again, this is focusing on water column. So back in 2012, very few water column leases. You can see it steadily growing, and we had less than 5 or so in 2012, and now we have well over 100 water column leases in yellow, and then that's the acreage in blue. So over 365 acres of water column leases now. In terms of farmed oyster production, again, steadily growing, and we had a banner year in 2017, and then 2021 was our best year ever by far. Close to 60,000 bushels of farmed oysters. Just a quick slide comparing wild harvest to farmed oysters. Wild harvest is in the dark blue there. You can see a declining trend over the last 12 years or so with wild oysters, although it looks like we might be bouncing back. So I think we have some hope. It's starting to kind of climb back up. But I just wanted to give you a comparison of wild harvest versus farm raised oysters in the state. In terms of dollar value, farm gate value, best year ever in 2021. We're pushing close to $5 million farm gate value for oysters. So really, really taken off. And then this is compared to wild harvest trip ticket data in the blue. You can see in 2018, for the first time ever, farmed raised oysters surpassed wild harvest oysters in the state in terms of farm gate or trip ticket value. So this got folks' attention, particularly the North Carolina legislature. They commissioned the North Carolina Policy Collaboratory to create the North Carolina Strategic Plan for Shellfish Mariculture. So we joined a national effort, and we're the first southern state to come up with a state plan for shellfish mariculture. And it was pretty aggressive. The goal in the plan is to reach $30 million farm gate value by 2030. And it identifies workforce development as one of the necessary avenues or measures to get there. So who's going to do that? Well, North Carolina Sea Grant seemed like a pretty good candidate. We have our 4 focus areas: oysters, crosscut, all those focus areas, healthy coastal ecosystems, resilient communities and economies, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and environmental literacy and workforce development. So seemed like a perfect fit for North Carolina Sea Grant to take this on. And shellfish mariculture, bivalves especially, is one of the most sustainable forms of aquaculture out there. So it really fit our focus area. And then workforce development was obviously another one. And like I said earlier, it's just a story about partnerships. We have the absolute ideal partner in Carteret Community College. They had a well-established aquaculture program already, and they didn't have any, although they covered some shellfish in their coursework, they didn't have any shellfish-specific courses or curricula. So we joined partners with them, and they're located right there on Bogue Sound, and North Carolina Sea Grant is located at the CMAS building, the Center for Marine Sciences and Technology, right on the Carteret Community College campus. So just couldn't have been a better location, couldn't have been a better partner. And then as far as capacity building, we had the right partner, but we didn't really have any equipment or anything to help teach the course. So in 2015, NOAA National Sea Grant provided the opportunity for us to build capacity, and they partially funded the Shellfish Mariculture Demonstration Center, which is right behind the CMAS building, and Carteret Community College Aquaculture Center. So our partners at Coastal Management and Environmental Quality awarded us a 2.6 acre lease, and we were able to get a lot of equipment and install that equipment for the course on that lease. In the western left side of the slide cove, we have bottom culture mainly for clams in that cove, and then in the center cove and the cove to the right, we have floating gear for oyster aquaculture, mainly for the half shell market, and some bottom gear as well. On the far right-hand side, you can see the Carteret Community College Aquaculture Facility, and the yellow shaded area is the pavilion that we received money to build. And that provided for a covered workspace in the heat of the summer or cold of the winter. And there's the pavilion there. This is a plan view of it, 1,200 square feet. Really, really nice in the heat of the summer to be able to work under that. And then the course itself, again, we received the capital or the funding from the National the NOAA office. And that was a competition that came out in 2019, establishing new aquaculture opportunities, social behavior, and economic needs in aquaculture. And we put in the proposal, developing a framework for prospective shellfish grower training in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So we had multiple partners, and the North Carolina Academy was just really the main component of this much larger grant. There are partners there, South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, and then Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant at the University of Georgia, and of course, Carteret Community College. So the objective one was to hire a research associate to develop the curriculum and teach the course. And there's the man, Brian Snyder, was hired in January 2020. Absolute perfect guy for the job. Objective 2, research and gather information from established training programs to develop or form the curriculum. And Brian always said, no need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of great programs out there in other states in the Northeast and Gulf Coast. And he was able to get a lot of information and work that into the curriculum for North Carolina Farming Academy, Shellfish Farming Academy. And that's what he did. He developed the curriculum, and it's a comprehensive curriculum with over 10 modules, and it contains everything you need to know to start a shellfish enterprise in North Carolina. Objective 4 was to actually deliver the course. So we did this with our partner, Carteret Community College, through their continuing education program. And we launched our first course in summer of 2020. It's 24 classroom hours and 24 accompanying hours of field sessions. So as far as developing the curriculum, Brian spent a lot of time meeting with current shellfish growers in the state, Division of Marine Fisheries, Carteret Community College folks, and then speaking with the directors of other programs in other states. And all that was really kind of a needs assessment, essentially. And he was able to take all that information and put together the curriculum by reviewing the work done by others and identifying stakeholder needs. So the main goal is workforce development, but the way to get there was to expose students to the many different facets of running a shellfish aquaculture operation, to build a foundational knowledge that they can use for farm work or decision making, and the ultimately increase the likelihood of success for anybody getting into the business, whether working on a farm or starting their own operation. The 10 modules include an intro to shellfish aquaculture, biology of bivalves, hatchery and nursery techniques, grow out methods, risk to shellfish crops, lease site selection, pest or best management practices, the leasing process, shellfish sanitation, and probably most importantly, the business side of it and the sales and marketing side. Here's just some of the cover slides for his modules that he put together. And of course, Brian doesn't know everything, right? So he really got a lot of help from guest speakers for specific modules or topics. Division of Marine Fisheries joined us. They gave talks on shellfish leasing process, about their shellfish lease siting tool, shellfish sanitation. We also had speakers from UNCW come and talk about their North Carolina shellfish siting tool. NC State College of Vet Med comes and they give talks on shellfish disease. And then Carteret Community College Small Business Center covers the business side of things. So really taking advantage of expertise elsewhere and inviting guest speakers or partners to deliver talks and modules on those subjects. The field days, every other Saturday for 8 weeks for 6 hours a day. And it really was designed to give students hands-on experience. And we worked from seed to harvest. It was probably, well, without a doubt, the best part of the course for me. Field day topics included nursery operation and maintenance, preparing and planting seed, investigating potential farm sites, constructing grow out gear, tumbling and grading oysters, biofouling control, harvesting and farm tours. And it really kind of helped to weed out people that thought that this was going to be like champagne and caviar dreams and sit on the back of your yacht and grow some oysters in between sips of champagne. So it really got people, kind of introduce them to the down and dirty side, the hard work side of what it means to be a shellfish farmer. And I think that's good. I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of the course. I mean, it really allows people to make an informed decision whether or not this is something that they really want to do and if it really is what they thought it was. So there's just cleaning some nursery and upwelling systems, preparing and planting seed, grading and doing volumetric counts. We actually had an industry breakthrough. This guy, Anthony, ended up developing a really perfect technique for ensuring a density of 50 clams per square foot when planting clam beds. So had a lot of fun. And then in a subsequent course, Brian, the instructor, was trying to explain this technique to another student, and it just didn't go over very well. Here's grading oyster seed. That's Sarah Pedigo from South Carolina Sea Grant. She came up and took the course. Constructing gear, floating bags, and then cages, oyster condos, preparing and deploying clam netting for clam culture, biofouling, that's a big issue. A lot of time spent clearing fouling on bags and gear. Tumbling and grading oysters. We have a grader and tumbler on site at the Carteret Community College. And then harvesting oysters. That's probably the most fun and best part. We have an oyster roast at the end, our little oyster roast. Sorting oysters by size for different markets. Harvesting clams. We have a clam dredge. This guy was having a little bit of hard time, so he needed some encouragement. Students are just having a lot of fun with the course. This is great. We had competitions, clam dredges versus rakes. Here we are harvesting clams, learning how to bag and tag the clams, labeling the tags properly for regulatory requirements. And then the farm tours. We had just fantastic partners. We had Down East Mariculture Supply. They're in Carteret County, down in Williston. Just salt of the earth people that open up their hatchery and nursery to our students. This is their brood stock conditioning system. That's Susan Hill and her husband. Sorry. But just really, you can't find better people. But they open up their hatchery and nursery to us, and they give students a complete introduction to what it's like to house brood stock, what it's like to set individual oysters on microculture. So they have setting operation there for oysters on the half shell, downweller and upweller nursery systems. Then our other commercial processes on Morris Family Shellfish Farms, biggest farm in North Carolina. Yeah, I believe it still is the biggest farm in North Carolina. This is, I think, one of their 8-acre leases here that they open up to us, and really spend a lot of time explaining what it's like to do large scale shellfish aquaculture in the state. If you're lucky, you'll get to eat fresh oysters while you're having the tour. There's a very happy student there. That's Jimmy Morris. He's probably the godfather of the industry in North Carolina. And here he's showing some students the nursery operation that they have. But in terms of stats and outcomes, 6 courses offered to date, over 76 enrolled, 60 have graduated. That's an 80%, almost 80% graduation date. 11 students were already in the business. 13 students have started their own business since graduating from the course. An additional 9 students have pending lease applications in. And then 3 students are already harvesting crops and selling their crops on the market. And if you'd like to join us, it's a mere $125 tuition. So please join us if you'd like to. And again, just all about partnerships. Many thanks to DMF, the National Sea Grant Office, Chuck Wyrick, Carteret Community College, NC State, UNCW, and then our commercial partners, Down East Mariculture Supply and Morris Family Shellfish Farms. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, there's my email at the bottom. Maybe like a 5-minute warning.
Okay. Hi, yeah, thanks for coming. I'm going to talk mostly about livelihoods and social networks today, and then how they facilitate or don't facilitate communication. So I'm David Griffith. I'm with Department of Coastal Studies at ECU. So first of all, I want to let you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about livelihood constellations. These are combinations of economic activities that allow members of households and communities to survive, reproduce, withstand shocks, and with luck, flourish. I call them constellations because they kind of behave like heavenly bodies behave. If you change something in one livelihood, it affects another livelihood. Just in the same way that, gravity and light and time and affect different, the way heavenly bodies operate. And also in addition to providing cash for household expenses and investments, generate some economic activities generate income in the form of things like food and health and well-being and security and other kind of non-monetary values. And others also involve kind of reorganizing households so that people can reduce expenses or consumption costs or things like that. So those also fall under kind of livelihood issues. The livelihood constellations, I've been studying for a long time because I've been studying fishing communities for a long time, as well as farm workers and migrants and a whole bunch of different communities that are based their livelihoods on ecosystems and ecosystem services. And consequently, they have a lot of seasonal fluctuations in their economic activity. It gives them an opportunity to do other kinds of economic activities during some times of year, to shift among different kinds of livelihoods, even within fisheries, for example, shifting between charter boats and commercial fishing, longline fishing, or something like that. Of course, livelihood diversification, if you have a bunch of livelihoods you can rely upon, it reduces risks like vulnerability to climate change, markets, and other factors that are pretty much external to somebody's control. Now, I'm not the first to talk about these livelihood constellations. That's my term, but they're also talked about as in terms of livelihood portfolios, diversification, multiple livelihoods. And economists have been talking about these for several years. They tend to break them up by how much income each livelihood contributes to the overall household and things like that. They talk about transfers, so that health insurance coverage provided by one household member allows other household members to engage in activities that don't provide health insurance and things like that. They talk about substitution, moving from, say, flounder fishing to construction due to regulations that restrict flounder fishing. So I'm not the first to talk about these issues, but as Holly was talking, the economies have become much more complex since the COVID. And so livelihoods are bound up with economies, and we tend to think of, when we think of the economy, that we think of the economy as this formal thing that, is out there, that people have these formal jobs, in fact, manufacturing and the service sector and things like that. But really, we live in a world of many, many economies, you know, so there's and with the fact somebody mentioned this morning, the blue economy, this gentleman back here. And, but we have these, you know, a variety of different economies, and these alternative economies have been getting a lot of press since the COVID thing. So the gig economy, we talk a lot about, there's been the informal sector, which in the around the world provides something like 80% of the occupations. And then this, I don't know if you can't really see this little graph very well, but it shows the increase in 1099 forms in the United States over a certain period, and that W-2 forms remain relatively flat, but 1099 forms, which are what freelance people tend to put in as tax forms, they have gone up over the years, and that trend is continuing. And so these livelihood constellations are becoming more and more popular, or more and more common in the environment. It also has to do with economic precarity, right? Because one livelihood isn't enough to, usually, you know, you have to have 2 income households, and people have to have more than one job. So people diversify their livelihoods. It's often a way of reducing risk and vulnerability to various kinds of shocks that come from climate change, environmental conflicts like that piping plover controversy out there in the Outer Banks, regulations, displacement from gentrification, all these kinds of things can cause people to force people to diversify their livelihood. Livelihood diversification can also come from new opportunities like catch share programs, sudden expansion of demand for seafood, and new seafood markets that are often provided for or facilitated by these catch programs that we have here in North Carolina. Now, the other thing is that livelihoods are often bound up with social networks, because social networks tend to be very important for gaining access to economic opportunities and livelihoods, and often in the informal sectors of the economy. So people tend to find work through their social networks. That's in the formal economy and in the informal economy. Social networks, of course, are also the building blocks of what we call social capital, or these relationships that people form to function effectively in a given social situation, like a community. Social networks are often based on trust, conferring legitimacy on the information that flows through them. And members of social networks often overlap in multiple settings. So they might belong to the same civic organizations, they congregate in the same places like docks or fish houses, and the activity they attend might be the same, like certain sporting events or blessings of the fleet or things like that. Now, I have a few, 2 or 3 slides showing some networks here in North Carolina, and social networks vary by community. And this is based on work that we did for Sea Grant on a couple of years ago on new generations. And this one shows the stars represent individuals that are centrally placed in networks, and through which a lot of information flows. And you can see that the big star is connected to 25 commercial fishermen and 2 organizations. The star in the middle is connected to a couple of or 5 commercial fishermen on the top and 7 in the bottom. And you know, so then the triangles represent centrally placed organizations, and that could be a catch share organization or a North Carolina conservancy, something like that, or Sea Grant. These are some variations on between one Outer Banks community and one Inner Banks community. And one is a multi-centered network. The Outer Banks network is multi-centered. So there's a whole bunch of people that you could rely on for information in this network. The other one is more dependent on really one fish dealer, kind of controls a lot of information that flows through this network. So if that person gets their information wrong, then a lot of people in that network are going to get their information wrong. Just to compare these 2 networks, the Outer Banks network There were several individuals that were centrally placed. The central individuals are fishermen, community advocates, and members of organizations, usually leaders of organizations. They had many social roles were represented, that are fishermen, advocates, fish dealers, and other roles. And then they had lots of connections across the networks. So the information was liable to flow through that information much more effectively. The interbanks network that I pictured, and this was only for one little community, and it's not just, it doesn't represent all interbanks communities, but there was really only one person who was truly centrally placed over the entire network, and that's a seafood dealer. The others varied in terms of how many network ties they had, but they were all somehow linked to that seafood dealer. And there were only 7 social roles represented, and most of those were either the dealer or a commercial fisherman. And there weren't many connections across networks. So again, in that network, information isn't going to flow very effectively. It's pretty much going to be controlled by one individual. Now you can see that this occurs in immigrant networks as well, where you have at first, you have when one immigrant comes, an early arrival, comes to a community in North Carolina, and they tend to be the central point of information. But over time, you can see these in phase 2, there's more contact with later arrivals, and you can see there's more contact among the other people besides just that one person in the middle. And then as phase 3 goes along, so a little more time passes and these network ties then expand, and there's more communication that flows through the network, right? And this tends to happen, and this wasn't my study. This was a study done by Epstein and Heiser-Cohen, but it's very typical to see this in immigrant networks here in North Carolina, which we've also studied. Now, the implications of network differences for livelihoods and implication flows are, because networks influence occupational decisions, the more connections one has, the more he or she is likely to develop and diversify his or her livelihoods. Because networks influence legitimacy and trust, the more connections they have, the more one can weigh incoming information in terms of how legitimate and accurate it might be. In circumstances where the information is exaggerated, misleading, or otherwise questionable, fewer sources of information reduce one's capacity to judge whether or not it's accurate or legitimate information. We have two cases of the spread of misinformation here in North Carolina. The first one was the hysteria in the mid-1990s. And then we have a narrative about the death of commercial fishing that we picked up in this study that we did a couple of years ago. I don't know how many of you remember the hysteria, but it was a case of exaggerated environmental risk. Some scientists came out, discovered this dinoflagellate associated with a fish kill. They jumped to the conclusion that it was deadly for fish and humans, very dangerous. The media then jumped on board. Politicians jumped on board. There was a sensationalist writer that published this book, and the waters turned to blood. But then Sea Grant commissioned a study of waterman health, and I was the lead investigator on that study. And I found that really fishermen were quite healthy, so it really didn't present a risk. And eventually the CDC said, yeah, there's no risk to humans here. But it was a case of really environmental or exaggerating environmental risk, right? The other thing was that there's this kind of narrative that we came across when we were doing the study of fisheries, where a lot of people said, well, commercial fisheries in the state of North Carolina are dying. And that's really not true. Even some commercial fishermen would say, well, we're seeing the end of commercial fishing, with the new trawling regulations and all kinds of things. But we conducted workshops, and Sarah's here. She was pretty much in charge of those workshops with 25 North Carolina fishermen under the age of 40 who were very active fishermen and fishermen. Some of them were women as well. And they were developing methods to sustain fishing livelihoods. They were diversifying their livelihoods by direct sales and community-based fisheries. So they were adding value to catch. They were becoming much nimbler. They were moving among different fisheries and fishing sectors, that is commercial and charter. And they also had grown up with regulations, so they weren't so afraid of regulations. They were incorporating immigrants into fisheries and support positions and on vessels, and they were becoming much more sustainable and much more environmentally conscious. So really, as opposed to dying, the fleet is just changing here in North Carolina, and it's still a viable fishery, right? So in summary, diversifying livelihoods into livelihood constellations is a strategy that is in line with the proliferation of economies and the recognition that different forms of labor contribute value to families and communities. Livelihood diversification is a way of reducing the risk of exposure to the inevitable fluctuations in economies and economic opportunities. Given the importance of social networks in one's search for and access to economic opportunities, livelihood diversification is related to more interconnected networks rather than those that are dominated by central figures. And again, more interconnected social networks can also improve one's ability to judge the accuracy and legitimacy of the information and get rid of the proliferation of misinformation. And I have this book that just came out, so I put a picture of it. But and it's about livelihoods and migration in the world's economies. But it's by Cambridge University Press, and it sells for like 88 pounds. So it's a very expensive book. I don't expect you to buy it, but I do want you to be aware. Maybe you can ask your libraries to get a copy. So anyway, but thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, David. We do have a few minutes left. We have several minutes actually until David was our last speaker. So we have, I think, about 15 minutes until lunch. So any questions first for David? And we can also open it up to the other speakers as well. Yes, let me get you on the microphone for the people online.
My question is for Ann. When you were doing your work, did you reach out to NCVOAD? Were they involved in any of your discussions?
No, we really used the network that they had for the interviews. And so at the end of this, we're going to go to those communities and kind of present this information and have some deeper discussions about what the next steps can be so we can put something into action. So we'll make sure to add them to the list. There were some VOADs that were a part of it, though.
Project that you're working on is very needed. And the reason I asked about NCVOAD was because you were talking about how they just cleared out the fire station and they just, built the plane while they were flying it. And we did the same thing through several. I was in Beaufort County and we got hit pretty hard several times, and brought in an NCVOAD, a couple different people from NCVOAD, and basically put them at a desk on a phone, and they became the hub for Beaufort County. We just kind of created it on the fly. And ever since then, I've had several discussions. I'm part of the RISE committee work, and Dr. Lonnie Crum, who's on that committee, she's working very hard in trying to put together or looking into the hubs. And so I wrote your name down. I want to connect you with her because it is very, very sorely needed. It's a great project, and I sure hope you pull it together some miraculous way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, really one of the impetus for this project was seeing Hatteras Village, who really went to Ocracoke, and they did what it sounds like your organization did. They walked them through it. And so there's so much institutional knowledge in Hatteras about the response. So making sure we capture that and maybe can leverage that for other communities. But also when we started talking about recovery, long-term recovery, those discussions were much more difficult because they have response down. Response is very like you do this, 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 and this. But when you start thinking about something more abstract like recovery, that's where there's also a lot of need we found.
questions for you, David. So you talked a little bit about misinformation working into the communities. So in terms of getting good information into those constellations or communities, I mean, would the best way to do that to target that kind of center individual and then kind of let it spread outward from there? Or do you work from the outside in, or we work for the National Weather Service. So thinking about getting good weather information to these people, you know, what would be the best opportunity to target?
Yeah, I would say those central individuals would be good people to target, but with the understanding that there's usually more than one in, you know, in any network, there's usually more than one. That Interbanks community was actually quite unique. It was different, and it had to do with immigration issues and the nature of the community and stuff like that. But yeah, those centrally placed individuals are good, but there's also centrally placed organizations, and the leaders of those organizations are also good people to contact. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Got a captive audience here, captive speakers. All right, with that, we'll give one round of applause to our speakers. We'll be done.